Hello, everyone. I'm Daz, and welcome to American Civil War and UK History podcast. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel or as a podcast from wherever you get your podcasts from. And if you're watching on YouTube, remember to hit the subscribe button and give us a big thumbs up. And to keep up to date with everything American Civil War and UK history, visit our website at www.acwandukhistory.com, where you'll find podcast, blog posts, and links to all of our social media pages. The link is also available in the podcast description. And joining me today is Mark Wheatcroft of the Battlefields of Britain's podcast. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, Darren. Hi, everyone.
This is episode one of a series of podcasts dedicated to the Battle of the Somme. Just quickly, the Battle of the Somme was one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the First World War, fought between July the 1st and 18th of November 1916 along the River Somme in France. Okay then, Mark. So before we get into the actual Somme and 1916, the war actually starts in 1914. So Britain and the outbreak of war.
Yeah, so obviously with the First World War, we could spend hours upon hours going into the causation. But in reality, we'll shorten it very quickly that in the summer of 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, is on a state visit to Sarajevo in what is today is now Bosnia. It was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he's assassinated by a Bosnian Serb, Gavrilo Princip. And this leads to a domino effect that will eventually lead Britain into war. So the Austrians want revenge and want to take it out on Serbia. Germany will eventually write them what is known as the blank check, which is their unconditional support. So one of the key elements to this is that prior to obviously all this happening in the summer of 1914, is that Europe has split itself into two power blocks of alliances. One being the Triple Entente, which is Russia, France, and Great Britain. The other being the Triple Alliance, which was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. So the Russians had given their support to Serbia because they're a fellow Slavic nation. Germany had given their support to Austria-Hungary. And so those two were always going to be on a collision course. Now, what brings Britain into the war is an old treaty that was signed when Belgium gained their independence from the Kingdom of Holland. And this policy of treaty declared Belgium a neutral country. And why this is going to bring us into sharp focus and directly up against Germany is that the Germans in 1905 had realised the predicament they were going to be facing should Europe go to war. And like I say, it had been a slow burn. So this, from 1905, this was already being predicted. And what they came up with was one of the German field marshals von Schlieffen devised what is known as the Schlieffen Plan, which is a way to fight a war on two fronts very, very quickly. Now, to do this, there was a number of elements involved. First of all, they were anticipating a slow Russian mobilization because they got their troops from all over the Russian Empire back to what would be the Russian Western Front, the German Eastern Front, to fight that war. So they predicted that they would have some time. So that meant that the plan was to launch a lightning strike against the French. And the way they were going to do that was to ignore the fortified border that existed between France and Germany, swing through neutral Belgium, and the actual plan was for the right-hand man's sleeve to brush the channel. That was how much it was going to do. Sweep around the rear of Paris, capture Paris, bring France to surrender, and then be able to then send troops back to fight the Russians. Now, this idea was already known that the Germans wanted to invade Belgium. So when they did on the 1st of August 1914, Britain sent an ultimatum that Germany must leave Belgium. When that expired, what then ensued was that Britain would then declared war on Germany, and British troops were mobilised and sent to Europe.
Okay. Nice one. Okay, so before the outbreak of war, and I've got some numbers here, and obviously you can explain a little bit about this, but how big was the British Army at this point in time? And this is still sort of empire time, isn't it? So, um, yeah, tell us about the numbers and what we're looking at before the war actually starts.
Yeah, so numbers wise, in terms of the large or the large European powers, Britain has the smallest army. However, where it's different is that it is a voluntary force. So these are all career soldiers. Whereas if you compare that to, say, the German army, for example, it's a conscription army. So although it is significantly larger than the British army, it was able. They use a conscription-based period, so it wasn't. I won't say it wasn't as well trained, but it wasn't a professional army in the same sense that the British army was. However, it did mean that they had a larger pool of manpower to fall onto. Now, as you've got on that PowerPoint there, the regular army, that's the paid for. They're the professionals. That's the day job. Reservists, these are people who have done their time in the regular army. They then go onto the reserve list, so that in times of war you could be recalled to the colours. A system that we've still got in place today. And then you've got the territorial force, and this is what today we call the Army Reserve. And these are the people who go about their daily business, 9 till 5 jobs, and then one evening a week they will parade at the local drill hall for some drill, and then go away on a 2-week manoeuvre camp during the summer. So like I say, relatively small compared to European powers, but very, very good, very, very professional. And you will see that at places in the early war when this army is deployed, at places like Mons, for example, where due to the rate of fire that the British were able to put onto the German army, they actually underestimated the amount of machine guns that we had, just because they were able to fire that many rounds a minute.
Okay, so let's talk about the Expeditionary Force. Okay, Mark, tell us about the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF. Of course, it's sent to Belgium, and so tell us about that.
Yeah, so obviously when initially we go to war to fight for Belgian neutrality. So our initial place of area of operations is Belgium, and the BEF is the name of the force that is sent to France. So you tend to, if you read a lot of books about the First World War, the British Expeditionary Force actually just becomes the name of the army that's serving on the Western Front throughout the most of it. Although over the course of the period, there's various incarnations of it, which we'll go through probably later on in the podcast. But this initial force goes out in the summer of 1914, much to the Secretary of War at the time, General Kitchener, wanted to keep that force in the UK because he knew that they'd need to build up what will later become known as Kitchener's Army, the Volunteer Army. But he was hoping that this unit, the Expeditionary Force, regular army, could be used to train and build that unit out. But unfortunately, circumstances dictated that we needed to get troops to France quickly to stop a quick German victory. And so the initial force went over. This was the regular army. It was then supplemented by the territorial force going over. And then eventually you get the new army, Kitchener's Army, which is made up of the volunteers who signed up in the immediate aftermath of the outbreak of war. And so you get it goes through a number of different permutations. And then towards the back end of the war, you then get almost what you'd like to call the conscript army, which is once the volunteers sort of dried up and conscription was brought in, that was the next phase of it.
Mm-hmm. And of course you mentioned Kitchener there, and I've got the recruitment poster there, the famous one. But yeah, tell us about the drive to get volunteers. What was the, so again, okay, yes, Britain's army is fairly small, but it's when you look at it on paper, there it looked fairly decent size. So why did they feel like they needed to get more men on, into the armies?
So you're going to be looking at a number of things. First of all, the sheer size of the enemy force, what they can deploy. Because, like I say, the German army was a conscript army, an army of national service. Possibly is a better way to put it. So anyone, as boys became of age, they had to do a mandatory 2 years military service, followed by a number of years on their version of the reserve list. So when war broke out, they've got a large pool of trained soldiers to bring back to their colours to fight. Obviously, we've got a Empire police force, is what our army's for. The British modus operandi when it came to defence at the time was the Royal Navy, and we can't forget then when we're discussing the British Army in the First World War, but all the money on defence went to the Navy. That was, we ruled the waves. We're a nation island. We rely heavily on imports, so keeping those sea lanes open was where defence spending went. So we needed to bring up the army to muster. Plus, as well, you've got generals that are seeing potentially what was to become in terms of the battles, the casualties. Because when you look at the 50 years leading up to the First World War, you've got things like the American Civil War, you've got the Boer War. Britain hadn't fought a war against another Western European power since their victory at Waterloo. So we've obviously fought in Europe against Russia in the Crimea, etc. But this is the first time that we're coming up against someone that's going to be at a similar level to us. The Germans, they've had a large increase in their navy as well, so they're challenging on that front. They've got a large army that's deployable on continental Europe. The forces needed. The large recruitment drive began, and there was an appetite for the war at the time as well. So when war broke out, millions of men flocked to the colours. Even before things like those famous recruiting posters actually came out, like immediately after war was declared, the Territorial Army offices were just rammed of people trying to sign up. You've only got to look at some of the pictures that you see from the past. So one of the battalions, when we get on to talking about the Somme, that we looked at, I'll speak about, which is the 16th Royal Scots, McRae's famous battalion, where at the start he was a prominent person in Edinburgh. He said he would raise an army in a battalion in 7 days, and he did it. And one of the reasons why he did that was that he rode his horse onto Tynecastle Stadium, the home of Hearts and Midlothian, and basically recruited the entire crowd at the football match on the Saturday afternoon.
Wow!
So people, there was an appetite of patriotism, and there was an appetite because the war was building. It was more of a matter of if not when, not if war would declare. When it finally did break out, there was a large calling to support the country.
Yeah. Okay, so this, of course, included the famous PALS battalion. So what was special about these battalions?
So the British Army had undergone in recent times, from 1914, had undergone a number of reforms, and those reforms started to try to make the regiments more area-based, so that people who were signing up to join the army had an affinity to your county. For example, had their own regiments. So where you'd be down in Kent, you'd be the East Kents, the Buffs. We've got the Royal West Kents as well. You've got the Essex Regiment, for example, from where I'm from. But there was a special thing with the Powers battalions. So Powers battalions were going to be part of what they call service battalions. So you had the initial regular army battalions, then you had your territorial battalions. You had extended territorial battalions. So, for example, one of the pictures that I've got of my great uncle who was killed on the Somme in September 1916, and they are the 2nd 6th Battalions, 2/6. And when I dug into it, the 6th Battalion of the Essex Regiment were based at Stratford, which is where he signed up. So what it meant was that the battalion had reached its unit strength. The 6th Battalion, they were the first six Battalion. They went off to do their training and deployment, and then they started again. It became the 2nd 6th Battalion. But with the Powers Battalions, then you got service battalions coming in, and these were battalions that were being raised purely for the duration of the war. As soon as peace is declared, these battalions are going to fold and disband. So they're service battalions, but the key element that they brought up to this was that there was a promise that anyone who joined one of these service battalions, whether this these battalions, these Powers battalions, tend to, not always, but they tend to be more recognisable in the north, places like Sheffield, Accrington, Leeds. They've all got these Powers battalions. I'd say there's nearly every town has a Powers battalion, but the promise that was given to the men who were signing up to join the Powers battalions was that they would not be broken apart. They wouldn't be sent. They wouldn't get to a depot and then be mustered into other units to replace fallen soldiers. They would stick together. So if you signed up together with your mates, you would stay together with your mates. So you had factories for forming companies, and what you'd get is that they'd use a natural hierarchy of that to build the battalion. So, for example, if you're a mill worker in Accrington or somewhere like that, then you'll find that most likely your company commander would be maybe the son of the owner. Then your foreman will be your sergeant. So you've got this natural hierarchy already built into the places that are forming these battalions. But the promise is that you will go to France together, you'll live together, you'll serve together. Ultimately, it means you're going to fight together. And as we'll see on the first day of the Somme, this is something that wasn't quite fully thought through as to the impact that this would have. But at the time, in the early days of the war, 1914, early 1915, it seemed like a good idea to get people to join up, because there was a camaraderie. You're already joining up with the people who you've been to school with, you work with, you play football with, you go to church with, or all the aspects of Edwardian life could come together in a Powers battalion.
Okay, Mark, can you explain how the Western Front developed and what it was like prior to the battle?
Yeah, so again, we need to go back to early 1914. You've got, so first of all, let's go back even further. 1870-71, you have the Franco-Prussian War, which is a decisive victory for Prussia against France. It ultimately leads to German unification, but it also means that a large part of France, Alsace and Lorraine, are annexed by Germany. So when the outbreak of war starts and the idea of the Schlieffen Plan, Germany knows France is going to launch a major assault in this area because it wants to regain this territory that they lost in humiliating fashion in 1871. So what the plan is or the Schlieffen's plan was to weaken that area to allow a French incursion and then override, have the heavyweight swing round through Belgium. Now, unfortunately, before war breaks out, von Schlieffen passes away, and Moltke, the German army commander in the West in 1914, is scared of this plan, so he pulls numbers of troops and divisions from the right hook, is the best way to describe it, to reinforce this area. So you get what's known as the Battle of the Frontiers begins. The French launch attacking that area. The German onslaught comes through Belgium. It's placed at Antwerp. Belgian army puts up fierce resistance. Britain is deployed in a small area around Mons. we hold it up there, but eventually the German army just keeps pushing around. It's too strong, and eventually you get to what's known as the Battle of the Marne, and this is the famous battle where the French troops are being ferried out to the battlefield from Paris in taxis. Which, if you go to the French Military Museum in Paris at Les Invalides, there's still one there. Um, and at that point, the German army is halted, and then what you get is a number of various different flanking movements in what's known as the race to the sea. And this is where each army, whether that's French, British, Belgium, or Germans, are each trying to find each other's flank, turn them to get round. But eventually, by the end of 1914, beginning 1915, and it's during this period that you get, for example, the First Battle of Ypres take place, and that's sort of like the last vestige of Belgian territory that's non-occupied, and why it becomes such a crucial place for Britain to fight due to the reasoning behind going to war. But eventually, you'll get to the point, say late 1914, early 1915, where the Western Front is running from the Channel coast down to the Swiss border, all the way through what's today Belgium, France. And there's no flank to it, so no one can turn. You're looking straight at, and the best way to describe it at this point is that it's the fortified border of Germany and France / Belgium, being manned by Britain. And in terms of, but because you've got such a large area of, like, these fronts going for so long, there's a remarkable different landscape as well that we need to consider. So it's not all, as most times it's portrayed in anything First World War, where it's just this fat features playing just of that nature, but not everywhere. So as you come down, start of the Belgian coast, up there near put down through towards Dixmude, it's relatively flat coastal plains. What the Belgians do is they open the sluices on the River Isar, so a large chunk of Belgium's actually flooded to prevent German troop movements coming through. You've then got the famous Ypres salient. Again, it's fairly flat country. It is rising, but when we talk about high ground in and around Ypres, we're looking at tens of meters, nothing more than that. But then in terrain like that, when you go to a region and look across, and you just see just how dominating it can be. It then swings down along the Messines Ridge out to Armentières, and then it cuts across what's known as the Douai Plain. Again, this is that flat, featureless landscape where you get places like the Battle of Loos in 1915. And then it starts going up the escarpment up onto the area around Vimy Ridge and Notre-Dame de Lorette, where the French will fight in 1915. The Canadians will eventually take the Vimy Ridge in 1917. Around the city of Arras, and the fighting in that sector in 1917. Then down on into the Somme sector, where just north of the River Somme is generally the point where the British line ends, and it becomes a French line from there onwards. I think it's Mariacourt, the place where the two armies meet, and then from there you'll swing down. You've got the Vosges Mountains, you've got places like Verdun, and then down towards the end you're almost into the Alps. So vast differences of terrain there as well. So that's going to dictate how the fighting is going to take place in across the front and where, because it's up in that place like the Vosges. Generally, there's a lot of letting it live actions going on where sort of it's hard to fight in those conditions. So it's just literally a fortified position where you can watch the enemy, make sure they're not attacking you, you're not attacking them. Everything's good. But then there's other sectors of the front where things are going to be a lot heavier.
Okay, in 1915 there is an Allied conference. What is decided there?
So the Allied Conference 1915. So what this isn't like the Allies in the Second World War, 42 onwards. We don't have a supreme commander at this stage. There will be, but that's later on. So each army is fighting independently. You haven't got one person in senior command. Ultimately, there's a number of aims that the different commanders want. So first of all, the French are desperate for Britain to take over more and more of the Western Front. Up to this point, we're holding, again, this is all give or take, the area around Ypres down to Messines. They want us to start taking over areas into France. And as troops are coming in, people like the Kitchener's New Army's divisions are arriving. We're finally getting up to strength to start taking command or taking control of places in France. And this is where, at the beginning of 1916, we take over the sector what will be known as the Battle of the Somme. One of the other things that was discussed was that there will be a triple assault made, simultaneous assault made on German forces by the British on the Somme, the French on the Somme as well, so that it's that joining point near Maricourt, the British assaulting from the north, the French assaulting in the south, and the Russians will launch an attack in the east, all simultaneously, to hopefully means that Germany can't use divisions and reserves to move them around to counter the various threats. It's all going to happen at once.
Okay, so let's talk about the Battle of Verdun. And so on the 21st of February 1916, the German army launched a massive assault against the French at Verdun. What were their aims?
So the aims against Verdun is Verdun, again going back a little bit, sits just to the west of the then border. So it didn't get captured during the Franco-Prussian War, but it's close to the border. So it's a very heavily fortified town. And what the German aims was if we could capture that will be such a humiliating blow to the French. They will do everything they can to recapture it. So it was either one or two generals, I think it was Falkenhayn, said the plan was to bleed France white. In that you capture it, they will launch assault after assault after assault to recapture it, and the amount of casualties that you would inflict on them will eventually leave it to the point where the French just have to surrender because they've just lost too many men. I think it definitely is the bloodiest battle of the First World War as well. It was known as the mincing machine. It is somewhere on my list of places to visit at some point.
Yeah, I was actually thinking that while you was explaining it. I was thinking, yeah, so that's in modern day France, is it now?
That's modern day France. Yeah, it's quite a long way in. It's on the way to Strasbourg. Remember, we drove through it when we went to Switzerland once back in the late 90s.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I've not actually sort of been to the been there and seen it. So it's somewhere that, as I say, it's quite a long old slog down there. So
yeah. Okay, as you mentioned, this would be the longest battle on the Western Front. How did impact planning for the Somme offensive itself?
it impacted a number of things. So first of all, there's sometimes there's a misconception in that Britain was forced to fight the battle because to take pressure off of Verdun. We was already committed to fight that battle, so it wasn't like we then jumped at it and we was underprepared, etc. We was already committed to fight that battle. When the planning stages was underway, beginning when the initial assaults at Verdun began, there was a number of dates put forward. So date-wise was slightly affected by it because the French said, look, we need you to get on with it, sort of thing, rather than sort of push it further back. Haig himself didn't really want to fight on the Somme. He would prefer to fight in Flanders. Again, it didn't really matter where Haig wanted to fight. We were going to be fighting in France because that's what the French wanted us to do. Also, it meant that we could join up with the French units. What Verdun did impact was the amount of French divisions that were able to fight at the same time. So they're not going to be able to supply as many men in their sector as originally planned, but otherwise, pretty much we're going ahead with it as per the plans that Haig had set out. So Haig is the commander of the general of the British expedition before Field Marshal Haig. He's subordinate in the area that we're going to look at, which is going to be the Fourth Army, is General Rawlinson, and it's Rawlinson, not Haig, who's going to do all the planning for the battle.
So, okay, why the Somme?
Well, if you look at it and look at it today, it's a very rural area. You know, there's not a lot of strategic value there. But there's a number of reasons. So first of all, as I said, you do have this area whereby you've got the joining of the two armies. That's a major thing. We can't forget that. That's where the British and the French army are joined. So that if you're going to do a joint offensive, where that's the best place for it to be. Also, you've got it sitting just above Amiens, which is a major railway hub as well. So for logistics, for bringing in all the supplies, everything you're going to need to fight this battle. Bearing in mind that over 1 million shells are fired in the bombardment, which obviously we'll come on to, prior to the battle. That's a lot of stuff you've got to bring in. You're bringing in all these men, you've got to bring in all the food, all the equipment, horses, everything that you need has to be. So being close to a major railhead like Amiens, and then the shuttle up to Albert, that is it is a good location. Also, another thing is it is at the furthest point of the German advance, so that it's at the point where their supply chain is most stretched as well. So if you're looking at it in that sense, it's probably one of the better places to fight.
What was their objectives to this location?
So this is where, and we'll probably come on to this further in the series, when we get to analysing the Somme and we look at whether or not it was a victory, a defeat, etc., it becomes quite hard because the overall objectives are quite vague. Ultimately, it's to make a breakthrough into break the German trench lines, penetrate inland, maybe launch cavalry in, and basically get the war moving again. You know, static warfare. You need to break static warfare to win a war. You can only really win a war in a short space of time if it's a mobile war. When it's static like this, you're looking at basically think of it as a siege, and ultimately that's what wins it. That we don't there's a siege warfare mentality. You've got the blockade working in the Channel and up in the North Sea. You've got the land fronts that are holding Germany in, and eventually the war will be won by a siege process more than anything else. So the idea is to break in. So when you get things like Blackadder and they're all talking about, we're going to be attacking in 2 days' time, we're going to be eating chips in Berlin. That was never the plan anyway. The actual objectives are quite vague, but it was just to sort of launch this major assault, break the German lines, penetrate in, and then once we get a war movement, then we can look to see what unravels and how then the plans would work. But in terms of this idea that ultimately there's things like capturing the town of Bapaume, which is 10 miles from Albert, straight down that old Roman road. They are sort of the short-term objectives, so to speak. But the long-term one, it was very, very, very vague. That's one of the reasons why Haig himself would prefer to fight, as he did in 1917 in Flanders, because there's a bit more that you can go for. So up there, it was to neutralize, to capture the Belgian coast, neutralize German U-boats operating out of places like Ostend and places like that. But on the Somme, because it is such a small, not small, such a rural landscape environment, that you haven't got those sort of standard objectives that you'd be looking to capture, like ports or railheads or things like that you can make significant use of. It was almost just to roll into the open countryside and then sort of push on from there.
So most people obviously have an image of the First World War battlefields, flat, muddy, but the Somme at the start, and I know you've touched on this a few times at the beginning of the podcast, at the start of the battle wasn't like that. So talk us through the terrain of the battlefield itself.
Yeah, so the terrain of the Somme will be one that you would recognise quite easy from being in Folkestone, because it's that same chalk downland that runs on the English Channel is running across on the southern side on the French Channel. So it's that same seam of chalk. So it's rolling hills. It was meadowland in 1914. Obviously, you've had two armies camped there, dug in since then, and that grass has grown. So it's long. There was, when you read the testimonies from the first day, they were saying that they were going into the grass and it is up to their waists in height, because it's obviously not being cut. The only time it gets cut is when a machine gun goes off and strafes them down. So it's very flat. It's dry. It's not muddy. As we move on into the autumn part of the battle, obviously you start getting the infamous white Somme mud from the chalk, but at this stage it's not. So it's nice and dry. It's pleasant grassland. It's not that archetypical. That image that people have of the First World War is a 1917 image around Ypres during the Battle of Passchendaele, where the heavens opened the day the battle started and it didn't stop. And yeah, they were fighting through sort of knee deep of mud at times, but on the Somme, it was on the 1st of July, it was a completely different story.
Okay, so Sir Douglas Haig and his two army commanders, Rawlinson and Gough, set about drawing up their plans for the battle. And so what were they?
Yeah, so the plans for the battle begins with a 7-day bombardment of the German position. So this is going to be one of the largest bombardments in the history of warfare. Well over 1.5 million shells fired onto German positions. The initial plan was also air spotting to see what's going on. Unfortunately, in the week before the Battle of the Somme, it was quite overcast, so the air crews couldn't get out. They couldn't see what was actually going on. So the artillery bombardment is there's a number of reasons for it. One, you're going to be using it to break up the wire entanglements that's in front of the German trenches that need to get through. Best equipment to do that is shrapnel shells. So shells that burst in the air, blasting down a load of metal balls. Hopefully they'll bring the wire down, cut the wire. Also, you're using high explosives to blow apart the German fortifications. What we need to remember is, if we backpedal a little bit, is that when the German army was stopped and you had the race to the sea, they, at all places in the line, they're not in their own territory. So they're able to pick and choose the land that they wish to defend. So in a lot of places, the Somme being one of them, you find in France and in Belgium these marker posts, and it shows the point at which the furthest advance of the German army, the point that the French army stopped the German army. Now, the one on the Somme is just outside the town of Albert, which is the biggest town in the Somme, British Somme sector. And it's quite close to the roundabout now that the Ibis Hotel is. If you know the Somme, a lot of people that go there probably stay there. It's one that I normally stay at. But then they sort of pull back a good couple of kilometres, and they do that because what they're doing is they're taking the higher ground everywhere. The Germans across the Western Front have nearly always got the higher ground because they had that ability at the time to withdraw. They're already deep within enemy territory. Their aim is to hold on to it until peace is sued for. And what's an odd kilometre of a farmland if it means that they're able to hold an advantageous position? So they're in that position. Obviously, you said the Somme area of it is chalk downland, so it does enable good tunnelling. So you've got deep concrete. They've got deep concrete dugouts for shelter, deep trenches. Again, they're on the defensive. They're the ones that are trying to be moved. So where the British trenches, the archetypal trenches that we think of in the First World War, was just sort of mud filled, held up with corrugated iron and sandbag. It's because in the British doctrine for trench warfare is that we will attack. They're jumping off points for attack. The doctrine that the Germans are pursuing is that entrenchments are defensive structures, so they're able to go to town a lot more in terms of their construction. Happy to see ground if it means using an advantageous position. So we've got this bombardment going on, but for the week before the battle, you've also got a number of mines being laid. So most famously, Hawthorne Ridge, which is up near Beaumont-Hamel, and then you've got the two biggest ones on there, straddling either side of the Albert-Bapaume Road. So Weissach, which is on the north side of the Albert-Bapaume Road, which was filled in the 1960s, 1970s. And then the most famous of them all, La Besselle crater, just to the south of the Albert-Bapaume Road. And all of these will be blown up prior to the men going over the top. Hawthorne Ridge was a bit contentious because there was arguments about when it was going to be blown, and eventually it does blow. Although on time, with the benefit of hindsight, it was blown too early because it did signal that the attack was going to take place.
So that brings us to July the 1st, and at 7:30 a.m. the whistle blew. Infantry was sent over the top from north to south. Can you talk us through what happened?
Yeah, so obviously you get the assaults going in, so there's numerous points along the line. Different things are going to happen. Starting off, the best way to do it would be to go from north to south. So start off, you've got the area along the road that leads into the village just there. And as I've already discussed, the Powers Battalion, it's quite a good place to start because that's where they're going to go into the attack. So just on the outskirts of Serre today, you've got a number of cemeteries and memorial parks. Serre number 2 cemetery, which is the largest concentration cemetery on the Somme, but also just beyond that is what's known as Sheffield Memorial Park, and this is a memorial park to the Powers Battalions. And when you go there, there's actually the small undulation of the trench still there, and you look up and see the rise of the land and see where the German positions are, and you can see why it's going to be such a devastating blow. Troops go out over the top. German machine gun and rifle fire open up. Machine gun fire, German machine gun fire, they use a tactic called what they call it indirect fire. So what they do is they'll crank the barrel up on a good elevation. And so rather than, as you see, probably best example I can think of in terms of film The opening scenes are Saving Private Ryan when you've got the guy in the pillbox with the MG42 and he's mowing straight at them as they're coming off the boat. The idea behind the type of fire that the Germans will put down on the French, on the British on the 1st of July is actually to fire high into the air, and then what's going to happen is that's going to start coming down almost like rain droplets. So what you're doing is you can then converge fire on and just put bullets into an area. And then once you start putting bullets into an area, they're going to start hitting targets. So it's less about accuracy and more about just covering ground. You'll see, if you was up there as well, the battlefield cemeteries, and see just how far they got. They didn't get very far. Just to put it into context, Accrington and Powys, which was the 11th Battalion Eastern Anglians, part of the 31st Division that attack into Sayre. In less than 30 minutes, they lose 720 men, 558. Of 720 men, 585 are casualties, 235 were killed, the other 350 are wounded. And the Sheffield City Battalion, 12th Yorkshire and Lancs, again part of the 31st Division, is 8 officers killed, 9 wounded, 426 other ranks killed, and 246 other ranks killed and 249 wounded. So when you've got a battalion of 800, then you start removing the designated 10%. So 10% of the battalions were always left behind in an attack. It's to create a cadre of the battalion, should something like this happen, that it can be reformed around. Then you take away ones who were sick, detached duties, things like that. You can see just how devastating it was. And when you then look in terms of, as we were discussing about the Powys battalions earlier, where they all come from these one communities, imagine when these news of the losses starts coming in the next few days, and the impact that that's going to have on those towns. Then from there, so you come across them up and over onto the Verdun Ridge, down onto the Verdun Ridge into the sunken road. So this is where the I think it's the Royal Fusiliers, Lancaster Fusiliers, but it's a Fusilier regiment. I can't remember exactly which one. They've dug tunnels in from the trench lines into the sunken road, and this is the famous Maidens film. One similar photographers goes in there and films the guys before they go in. Again, they go over top straight into the fire, and they're pretty much stopped quickly. From there, you go up onto Hawthorne Ridge. So just behind where the sunken lane was is where Maidens shot the film of the Hawthorne Ridge mine crater going up, and up on the Hawthorne Ridge, and it swings round, and you get to what today is the Newfoundland Park Memorial Park. So this is another desperate scene of fighting. It's where the 29th Division go in, and today it's known as Newfoundland Park because the people of Newfoundland, in the aftermath of the war, had a subscription so they could buy the piece of land where the Newfoundland Regiment was decimated. They weren't the only decimated regiment there. They were the third wave to go in. So when you go there, if you look on the ground in the car park, you can see painted crenellations of trenches. And that's actually where they start their assault from, because they can't get up to the frontline trenches because those frontline trenches are support trenches that are full of wounded soldiers. So they don't actually go into the attack until 9:15 that morning. So you've already had nearly 2 hours of fighting, 2 hours of bloodshed, where we're not British troops in this area just aren't getting anywhere. And when they go over the top, they killed or missing is 324, wounded 386. When they formed up for roll call, there were 68 men. on parade for their roll call. Okay. So again, this northern sector, like when people think about how bloody and deadly the first day of the Somme was, it's this northern sector that's the real devastating area. Like, it's not good throughout most of it, but this area is just utter carnage up here. You then um, from the Newfoundland part, the area around Beaumont Hamel, you come down, the line swings down, it goes through the hamlet of Hamel itself, down to where you can see on the map the railway line, across the Ancre River, and then it starts going up. And this is climbing now up onto the Tipvale Heights. So again, today, if you're coming up that road, off directly ahead of you will be the Tipvale Memorial to the Missing. You're going to get to the left, you're going to get the Ulster Tower and Mill Road Cemetery. And then on the right is the Connaught Cemetery, and then behind that Tipvale Wood. And it's from Tipvale Wood that the next unit I'm going to talk about is the 36th Ulster Division. They attack on what is known as the Schwab, what's known as the Schwaben Redoubt, one of the main pinnacle points on the German defences. You can just see it on the bottom right of your map there. And this is one of the success stories. So we do the Ulster Brigade. They've got an interesting story. These are all Ulster Unionist people. And in 1912, you get the Ulster Unionist Bill. The Irish Home Rule Bill comes before Parliament, and prominent people in the loyalist community start raising paramilitary units like the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force. And when war breaks out, they said, look, we're loyalists, we're unionists, we're part of Britain. So those forces deploy and are mustered into service in the British Army. And they attack from the Tipvale Woods onto Schwab and down. They do manage to get in. What happens when they get in, though, is that the Germans, they've already got counter-attack planning. So the German artillery is already ranged in. So when the Ulsters get into the Schwab and down, that artillery fire starts falling into no man's land, and what that does is that cuts the troops that do manage to make that break in off from any support and any retreat, and it means that the counterattacks can come in and they get overwhelmed and they get forced out. So they don't manage to hold on to that, but they do get in there. But before they do attack, you get the first VC one on the 1st of July, and it's won by an Ulsterman in the 14th Royal Irish Rifles called Billy McFadzean. And McFadzean was trained as a bomber in his unit. So he will be in charge of the Mills bombs, hand grenades, and bombers would be that they're well trained in their jobs, and they will be going in alongside to bomb out German positions, dugouts, things like that. And what they're doing is that they're prepping, they're arming themselves, and a box of the Mills bombs falls off onto the floor, and one of them, the pin, falls out, and they're in the trenches. It's cramped, it's combined. But Fadzien knows if this goes off, what it's going to do to him and his mates. And he doesn't think twice about it. He drops himself onto this live grenade without the pin, and takes the blast. It kills him outright. However, he's awarded the VC for his actions. It saves the lives of his mates. The rest of the ones that were close by only suffer minor wounds. And actually, on the day that King George V presented the VC to McFadzean's parents, he said, out of all the VCs that I've given out, this one's the bravest.
Wow.
So from there, so you then swing round, you come past the ruins of the Tipval Chateau, past the ground where now the magnificent memorial to the missing stands, and then it swings across past the Leipzig Redoubt, across what's known as Mash Valley, which you'll understand why it's called Mash Valley in a moment, and then up to the Albert Bapaume Road, which dissects the battlefield. From there, it's a short hop across through the village of La Basselle and to the outskirts where in the morning one of the two both of the mines are blown in this area shortly before the battle, one at Weissap, like I say, north of the road, and then La Basselle to the right. And this is where McRae's battalion, this is the 16th Royal Scots, part of the 34th Division. This is the regiment I spoke about earlier when discussing units being brought into service, and it's raised by Sir George McRae, a prominent person in the Edinburgh community and politician. He said he'd raised the regiment in 7 days, and he did. He raised it. He did a lot of his recruiting on a Saturday afternoon at Tynecastle Stadium at home of Hearts, Middle Overland Football Club, and of their number, 16 players amongst their number. And they attack at La Basselle after the explosion of the crater. And again, this is another area where they do make significant gains. They do make gains. They punch through, they get through La Basselle, out the other side, and they actually enter the village of Contalmaison alongside, I think it's the Tyneside Irish. Get up there as well. Again, they're only there in small number. They get pushed back quite quickly and quite easily. And of the 814 men that assaulted that day, 585 are going to be casualties. And then it swings out of Contalmaison around to the south of Mamay, and then heading down towards Montauban. And then the last regiment I'm going to talk about, because there's so many to talk about, is the 8th Devonshire Regiment, part of the 7th Division. So they attack Mamay from the south from Mansell Copse. And a lot of these names that we're saying now, as we go on and go deeper into the battle, as we go through July, August, September, are going to come out. So Mamay Wood is a horrific battle that the Welsh Division are going to be in. But when the Devonshires attack from their position, their commanding officer had a premonition of. He looked at the ground, he looked at the models, and he knew it was almost going to be suicide to attack there. And they, out of the men of the 8th Devonshires, 50 are killed, 158 are wounded. When eventually the battlefield gets cleared and the bodies are brought in, they're placed in a former frontline trench, one of the frontline trenches they were assaulted from. And in the early days after the war and during the war, before the Imperial War Graves Commission, what's now the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, uniformed the cemeteries to some degree, there was a wooden sign up there, and it said the Devonshires held this trench, the Devonshires hold it still. And it's actually now on there's a Portland stone marker that has that epitaph on there. So when you look at the early the early cemeteries, there's different headstones and different markers and things like that. But obviously the War Graves Commission in the interwar years sort of formalised it. They did great work, obviously.
Okay, so obviously we know a lot of these losses can be attributed to the awful weapon of the machine gun, but also artillery as well. So just give us an idea of how, oh, well, you've told us pretty much, but how deadly these weapons are, you know, just
Yeah, so obviously that one there, that's a British machine gun team. That's a because um, high rate of fire, water cooled machine guns. You can see um, to the rear of it, you've got the screw there that allows elevation to be adjusted. So like I say, you can pour pitch on it, it turns it into non-direct fire. And what you find towards the end of the war as well is that machine guns are almost acting like auxiliary artillery. That you're able to do fire suppression, all the things that you would use artillery for, the machine guns doing it as well. And then in terms of artillery, you're going to be looking at a number of different shell types that they're going to be using. So the ones there, they're your that'd be Royal Garrison artillery, the big heavy howitzers, firing the high explosive shells. So these are your bunker busters, so to speak, if you want to use sort of a modern day terminology. Big high explosive shells to blow things apart, and then you're going to have your field artillery and your horse artillery there on the 18 pounders. So anyone that's familiar with the King's Troop Royal Artillery, the 18 pounders that they pull are all First World War guns, and they will be firing a lot of time shrapnel shells. And when you're looking at a artillery defensive fire against infantry, shrapnel is going to be the killer. You know, if you look even at previous wars, you've got canister shot, things like that. There's turning artillery pieces into large shotguns, and that's what they're going to do. And that's what cut off the Ulster Division TFL was the shrapnel bullets. In case I've actually got on me stand there a jar of relics that I've picked up over the years, and quite a few of the shrapnel shells have come from the Ulster Tower. They always have a few. There's always a tray in there. It's always sort of like help yourself. But yeah, that's if you do go over, definitely go to the Ulster Tower and do their do the tour of the TFL trenches, because what happens there is the Royal Irish Rifles, which is a current British Army regiment, go over each year and recut them. So that's quite cool.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what actually happened to the wounded? Because there were so many of them, wasn't there? So what happens to these guys?
Yeah, so wounded, you've obviously there was provision for the wounded. Unfortunately, they're just going to get overrun because the sheer amount of wounded that is going to be flooding back in over the next few over those next few hours, days. So within each regiment, you'd have stretcher bearers, so they'll be there, grab them, bring them back. You'd have your regimental way post. That's your first point, your triage point, as you will. They would have been sort of set up in the frontline trenches, maybe the small trench, sort of very close to the front line. And like I said, they're there to triage. Are you a quick wound that we can patch up? Are you a back to base job? Are you too far gone? In which case, all we're going to do is pump you with as much morphine as possible and let you slip away. Then from there, you'd have your field ambulances taking them back to the casualty clearing stations. This is where you're going to get better treatments. You're going to get things like surgeons, things like that there that are able to do those sort of life-saving treatments. And then again, depending upon level of injury, you'd either be light wounds, you'd be patched up, sent back to your battalion fairly quickly, possibly put on light duties for a little while just to get covered. There'd be some provision there as well, sort of like on the medium term that you'd have your recoup in France. And then the ultimate would be your famous blighty wound, the one that gets you home, and that could be get you home for a few months just to recoup. So, for example, a broken leg or something like that, that would be back home a few months, and then you'll probably be deemed at some point fit for duty and back out there again. Or it would be over and out sort of thing, that you're back, but you're deemed unfit for future military service, in which case you'd be given your papers. Later in the war, you'd also be given your Silver War badge. That was to donate someone that had done their service and had been discharged. Honorably discharged, so that they weren't given white feathers, no Cuy de Cadis, even though they'd already been out there and done their time. But for the most part, majority of them would find their way back somehow.
Mm-hmm. Okay, mate. Thank you. Okay, so obviously it's a bit of a disaster, isn't it? The first battle of the Somme, and the news that filters back and to Britain and the High Command. How did they all react to this disaster?
Well, it took a while for it all to sort of, I wouldn't say sink in, but come together just to how bad it was. So, just to give you some numbers, British forces on the first day of the Somme suffered 57,470 casualties, killed or wounded, just shy of 20,000 men killed. So to make that a visible analogy, the London Stadium holds 60,000. So you're 2,000 short of that. So that gives you an idea of the sheer number of people. And I think that sometimes it can be hard to visualize that sort of number. But yeah, one of the biggest football stadiums in the UK is killed, wounded, or missing. That gives you an idea. In terms of how people react back home, or the High Command. The High Command, I think it takes a long time for it to come in. There were talks at some point that there are rumours, and there are all rumours about certain generals putting a pistol in their mouths and killing themselves. Not one of them actually did that. I think in terms of, but we often look at the First World generals as these being these heartless generals, but they're there to win a war at the end of the day. You know, we see it in the American Civil War with Grant, for example. Places like Cold Harbor, he just throws men against it. When the news starts breaking back home, at the end of the day, there's still a war ongoing. So people are still sort of there's no sort of riots or anything like that due to the nature of the losses. Obviously, as we discussed, things like the Pals battalions, this is where the idea of the Pals battalion completely falls down. It's why, from this point onwards, they don't exist. They're not even thought of being brought into existence during the Second World War. It's because the decimation that it does to the population of that town. You know, all of the young men that go off to war and they just don't come back. You know, you're getting numerous. There'll be streets in these towns where not a single family, or in these towns not a single family's gone untouched. You know, either their family member or their close friend. You know, it's where it falls down with the Paris battalions, and it's the aftermath that really affects it. But as I say, it has to keep on going. So it wasn't a kind of shut it down completely. There's going to be in terms of the battle going forward, there's going to be a change of emphasis. The battle itself is going to sort of predominate now in the southern sector of the battlefield. That northern sector where I think not a single foothold was gained is going to be kind of shut down, but the southern sector is going to keep on going because there's a war to win, and there's the French are still locked in that death wrestle at Verdun, and the British Army needs to do its thing, and keep the fight going in the Somme sector.
Thank you, Mark, for telling us about the 1st of July and the Battle of the Somme. Obviously, as we know, the Somme goes on, as I mentioned at the beginning, all the way till November of the same year. So there will be more to come, and we will continue delving a little bit deeper into some of the battles that take place over that period. So anyway, thank you, Mark.
No problem, Daz. I'll speak to you soon on the next bit.
And all that is left to say, ladies and gentlemen, is cheers.
Yes, thank you.